There's a name you've worn your whole life. You've introduced yourself with it, signed every important document with it, laid loved ones to rest beneath it. But almost no one ever stops to ask the uncomfortable question, what if that name was never really yours to begin with? What if it was passed down like a shackle disguised as a birthright? What if the surname on your birth certificate, your passport, your grandmother's headstone once belonged to the man who enslaved your ancestors? And what if DNA science right now is finally peeling back that disguise? Sit with that for a second. Because what's happening inside genealogy labs and DNA research centers across the United States isn't a minor historical curiosity. It isn't a heartwarming ancestry segment on morning television. It's one of the most significant reckonings with identity in modern American life, and most people don't even realize it's underway. This story doesn't begin with any of us. It begins in the cargo holds of ships. Between the early 1500s and the 1860s, roughly 12 of 5 million people were forced aboard slave ships bound for the Americas, a number that doesn't even include the countless others who perished on the march to the coast before ever boarding a vessel. Around 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage, only to be sold into forced labor on plantations, growing sugar rice, cotton, and tobacco. That's more people than live in many countries today, kidnapped, stripped of everything renamed and sold. Here's the part history classes rarely explain in full. When enslaved people reached American shores, they lost more than their freedom. They lost their names, the names of their clans, their tribes, their bloodlines. They lost the thread connecting them to kingdoms that had existed for centuries. Because stripping away someone's name is one of the most effective tools of dehumanization ever devised. It erases their origin, severs every ancestor who came before. It forces a person to start over from nothing. And the renaming wasn't haphazard, it was deliberate and systemic. Enslaved Africans were given new names chosen by the people who enslaved them, first names, picked at will, surnames that marked them as property rather than people. Of the roughly 8,000 Africans brought directly to the American colonies and the early United States, most were given English-sounding names, occasionally Scottish, Welsh, or Irish. Frequently, these surnames belonged to their enslavers, or in a somewhat gentler twist, to whoever had eventually freed them. Sit with that. Some of the most common black surnames in America today, carried by tens of millions, trace directly to the men who once owned their ancestors. Look closely at specific surnames, and a hidden architecture of American identity starts to emerge. Take Washington census. Analysis found roughly 3,000 Americans carrying that surname, and about 90 of them are black, a higher concentration than any other common surname. George Washington himself held 317 people in bondage at the time of his death. The prevailing theory is that freed people took his name out of anger. It may have been aspiration, irony, or simply because it was the most recognizable name they knew once they were finally permitted to choose a surname after the Civil War. The result, Washington, is now statistically the most common surname among black Americans, carried almost entirely by descendants of people enslaved by men like him. Then there's Jefferson. About 75 of people with that surname are black. Thomas. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal while enslaving more than 600 people over his lifetime. That name now belongs mostly to their descendants. Jackson follows a similar pattern. 53 of everyone named Jackson in America is black, and there are more black Jacksons alone than all Washingtons and Jeffersons, combined of any race. Most people carrying these names have no idea what history is folded inside them. For most of American history, genealogical research for black families hit a hard stop. The federal census didn't record enslaved people by name before 1870. Everything before that year often vanishes into silence. Ancestors before that date might appear only in slave schedules. Documents that logged people not by name or family, but by age, sex, and physical description, the way livestock might be tallied. That wall stood for over 150 years. DNA testing is now taking it apart. Platforms like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and Family Tree DNA can now do something no archive or paper trail ever could reach back across centuries of enforced silence and reconnect people to specific regions, specific ethnic groups, even specific clans in West Africa, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan, the Wolof, the Mandinka, the Mende, the Fulani. These aren't just labels on a report. They're civilizations, the Yorubas, sophisticated urban culture, the Akan-Ashanti empires, legal and military systems, the Igbos networks of tradecraft and community governance. None of these were primitive societies. Discovered by slave traders, they were complex civilizations, deliberately targeted and dismantled by the slave economy. So when someone who's carried a name like Williams, their whole life an English name, meaning son of William, handed down from a slaveholding family, opens a DNA report and sees Yoruba or Igbo or Akan, something shifts. A name that was never truly theirs is suddenly joined by something older, something that was always there encoded in their biology through 4 centuries of attempted erasure. Some of the most common Black American surnames today: Washington Jefferson, Jackson Williams, Johnson, Brown, Jones, Davis, Harris, Robinson, mostly trace back to enslaver surnames, or were chosen after emancipation when the formerly enslaved were forced, then later permitted to adopt English surnames. Other names tell different stories. Freeman was often chosen deliberately by newly freed people to announce their new status to the world. Davis carries a darker irony. The surname of Confederate President Jefferson Davis was later adopted by some formerly enslaved people, a strange twist in a country whose Confederacy fought to preserve slavery itself. Then there are the occupational names: Mason, Cooper, Carter, Taylor, Fletcher. English surnames tied to trades handed to enslaved people based on the work they were forced to perform. A person who made barrels became Cooper. A person who drove carts became Carter. The name became a job description. The person disappeared behind it. And the DNA findings go further into territory that complicates the narrative in painful ways. Roughly 30 of African American men who test their Y chromosome lineage discover a European paternal line, a genetic record of the sexual exploitation enslaved women endured at the hands of enslavers now impossible to deny, thanks to genetic evidence. This genetic legacy isn't only about ancestry. Researchers are also studying how generations of chronic stress under slavery may be linked to health disparities that persist in Black communities today, a kind of physiological inheritance layered beneath the surname. And yet the same DNA record also reveals extraordinary cultural survival. Yoruba spiritual traditions endured the Middle Passage and re-emerged as candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, and Vodou in Haiti. The Monde Griot tradition of storytelling through music survived and evolved into the blues, which gave rise to jazz, rock, and roll, and much of the dominant music of the last century. West African civilizations of artisans, farmers, and storytellers left legacies that live on in the food, faith, rhythm, and resilience of their descendants. The culture wasn't destroyed. It transformed, went underground, and resurfaced in new forms, and DNA is now drawing the line between what was taken and what survived anyway. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a story about who gets to define identity now. For generations, Black identity in America was shaped by names imposed by enslavers and reinforced by a legal system uninterested in preserving African heritage. Now, through genetic testing, people are tracing their lineage to specific coastal regions and slave ports in West Africa, discovering a possible Igbo connection to the Kingdom of Benin behind the name Williams, or a Wolof heritage from Senegal behind Johnson, or an Akan connection to the Ashanti Empire behind Washington itself. Some people, once they learn this, choose to reclaim ancestral names, an act made possible by a simple saliva test. Others see the name they inherited through slavery differently, not as shame, but as a monument to survival proof that their family endured and built something meaningful with a name no enslaver ever intended to become a legacy. The bigger question this research raises is a national one. What is owed to people whose identity was systematically dismantled as part of an economic system? Every DNA match to a West African ethnic group, every surname traced back to a plantation owner adds to a growing body of evidence not shrinking, but multiplying one test at a time. In some cases, communities in West Africa have received DNA connection requests from strangers in America only to discover they weren't strangers at all. They were family connected by biology, that no ship, no auction block, and no ledger could ever fully sever. The thing the slave trade tried hardest to erase the knowledge of where people came from was never fully gone. It was only waiting encoded for science to catch up. That reckoning isn't coming. It's already here, playing out in the biology of tens of millions of people, learning one test at a time who they were before someone decided to take that away from them. Note: this piece blends historical and genealogical research with more speculative claims, particularly around Göbekli Tepe, comet impact theories and precession that are contested or unverified in mainstream archaeology. I've kept the surname DNA slavery section, which rests on well-documented history and established genetic research as the through line. Let me know if you'd like the Göbekli Tepe section rephrased separately with clearer framing around which claims are mainstream versus speculative.